But interest rates would have shot up too, because the banks would have started to run out of funds to lend. And so the interest rate goes up to tell you, hey, we're kind of running low, so if you're going to borrow, it better be for something important. And that would have immediately put an end to the speculation in real estate. But when you're the Soviet commissar, you can keep this phony thing going, because you just create more and more and more money, and now the banks have a ton to lend, and you can keep an illusion going. And that's in fact what we've endured. So there can be psychological factors for why the money created by the Fed goes into a particular sector like housing. It could be that people became psychologically attached to housing. But who's pushing the accelerator? I mean, where are you getting the wherewithal to actually make these purchases? It's coming from the Fed. So therefore, I hereby exonerate HGTV of any blame for the housing boom. Although I have heard that argued, that you watch those shows and you think, if I'm not living in a $750,000 house, I'm the biggest sucker on earth. I mean, you watch these shows and everybody's doing that, everybody's flipping houses. And the sick part of it is that, if you're up at 3:30 in the morning and you watch those half-hour infomercials about how you can get rich, and my favorite is John Beck's system, where he's going to teach you how to buy houses for $100, and you can resell them. And the thing is that, see, nobody ever got rich on those systems. Like, you don't know anybody who actually got rich that way. But you might know somebody on your street who made a bundle flipping houses. So arguably, what Alan Greenspan did was worse than what John Beck did, because most people don't fall for that. But people really persuaded themselves that this was real. This was something real. I can buy 5 houses with no money down and no job. This is real, people thought. And there's been a lot of criticism of the federal government for intervening in the economy to push down lending standards, or even eliminate some lending standards. And so, of course, we got things like the adjustable rate mortgage, which isn't a modern phenomenon entirely, but it was used an awful lot more. We got the no money down, the liar's loans. You just come in and say, I work for NASA, nobody checks, fine. I'm an astronaut, nobody bothers. The reverse mortgage. When I first heard about a reverse mortgage, I guess I thought that would be like a house borrowing money to buy you. But that's not what it is. It's a home equity thing. But all these things, got going, and people are spending their equity. But in terms of the lending standards, we need to remember that the Fed also plays a role here, because when the Fed creates new money, because of the incentive structure that exists in our banking system as presently constituted, all the banks want to be lent out to the maximum extent possible at any given time. So if they suddenly find themselves with a lot more money on their hands, how are they going to lend that extra money out unless they lend it out to people who wouldn't have qualified otherwise? Like, for example, if I've got a basketball team, and all of a sudden, right after I pick my players, I'm told, oh, by the way, you get to pick 2 more players. Well, logically, where am I going to pick those 2 from, if not from the pool of people I previously rejected? So there is inherently, there's a downward pressure on lending standards just by virtue of the Fed. Now, with all this going on, we also have the phenomenon referred to as the Greenspan put, which is a phenomenon that, of course, Greenspan will never admit to, but everybody knows existed, which was that the idea that Alan Greenspan and the Fed will bail you out one way or another if anything really goes sour and you are a major, major Wall Street player. And under that presumption, which turns out to have been 100% correct, by the way, because, of course, they have done that. So anybody who said, oh, there was no Greenspan put, oh yeah? Well, look around you. They're honoring it every 3 seconds, right? So why wouldn't you make that ridiculous risk? Why wouldn't you act like this? The very existence of the Fed institutionalizes the phenomenon of moral hazard. The idea that I should take extra risks because the losses will be spread out among the general population, but the profits will be kept by me. Well, who could be surprised by this? This is not the free market. Again, on the free market, people are afraid of losing. And so they don't just behave insanely. In fact, the reason that you could go to Vegas and make $1 million, are you being irrational not to do that? Well, of course not, because you might lose. Normally you have this sense of risk. But when you have a monopoly paper money producer that can create as much money as it needs to bail you out, well, okay, it changes the way you think. And this has been true in case after case. Well, let me quote to you. Here's economist Anthony Mueller talking about the Greenspan put. He says, since Alan Greenspan took office, financial markets in the U.S. have operated under a quasi-official charter which says that the central bank will protect its major actors from the risk of bankruptcy. Consequently, the reasoning emerged that when you succeed, you will earn high profits and market share, and if you should fail, the authorities will save you anyway. The Financial Times newspaper warned of a destructive tendency, because of the Greenspan put, toward excessively risky investment supported by hopes that the Fed will help if things go bad. Now, I do at least want to acknowledge the objection that we have had booms and busts before there was a Federal Reserve, so you can't blame it all on the Fed. I mean, it's easy enough for me to blame this on the Fed, because the Fed obviously did, from 2001 on, they did push interest rates absurdly low, down to 1%, and held it there, pushed it down there for a full year. They did do this, so it's easy for me to point this out. But what about the 19th century, before we had a Fed? You know, Mr. Wise Guy, what do you say about those? And I have a section in Meltdown that does talk about these booms and busts before the Fed. But if you look at them, it's the same causes. I mean, yeah, okay, there's no institution called the Federal Reserve System. Alan Greenspan was not alive at that time. I will grant that trivial point. But if you look at the major panics, Panic of 1819, 1837, the main ones are 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, and 1907. They all have the same precipitating factors. In the first two cases, you have a government monopoly national bank that's inflationary, that starts the economy on a boom that leads to a bust. So that's sitting right there. The Austrian theory also applies when you don't have a central bank, but when the banks try to lend more than there exists in saved resources, when they try to print up money as if it represents resources when it doesn't. So in other words, it's the same phenomenon all the time. In fact, even in the 1870s, we've been told for years that the 1870s is the so-called long depression. We had a depression for 6 miserable years. Well, it turns out modern economic historians don't believe that anymore. They believe we had a brief recession in 1873, but if you actually look at all the economic indicators in terms of consumption and wealth and employment and everything, it was a boom. Prices were falling, but wages were staying about stable, so wages were rising. So it's doing okay. Well, I should say, wages were at least holding steady in the 1870s. But meanwhile, this was becoming a mass consumer society in just that one decade. And we've been told this was actually a decade of depression. The reason we've been told that was that prices were falling in that decade, and economists today have been taught in sort of robotic fashion that falling prices are devastating. We can never ever want falling prices. So if you see falling prices, that means there was a depression. Well, economists don't believe this anymore. Even the New York Times, kicking and screaming a couple years ago, wrote a column saying, okay, there was no depression in the 1870s. It actually turns out to be bogus. But and I don't believe falling prices are a bad thing, but that's another matter. So all these prices, it turns out, are basically from the same factors. And this is bizarre how eerily similar what I'm about to read you is to what we're enduring. But this was written in 1837. This is somebody who's observing the Panic of 1837. He's a New York editorial writer named William Leggett, supporter of Andrew Jackson. And listen to how he describes his society and what's been going on. Crazy real estate bubble, people are out of their minds making investments, they all think they're going to get rich. Gee, that sounds totally different from the situation we have. And what is his diagnosis? It's the same thing. It's the government's involvement in banking, interfering in the banking industry,